Hello and welcome to the Read to Know podcast, where the goal is to actually remember what you read. On this podcast, we go through a book one chapter at a time, and each week we actually practice remembering what we've read. If you want to follow along, we're currently working our way through Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. This week we're discussing the chapter entitled The 7 Habits, an Overview, and next week we'll be looking at the chapter entitled Principles of Personal Vision. I'm Zach Brown, and my friend Chris Yarber is joining me to help discuss and break down this book. Thanks for listening and enjoy the conversation. All right, Chris, we're here again.
What's up,
man?
We're
doing this.
I love it.
All right, I really enjoyed the first one. It was fun.
I did too. Yeah, I was a little intimidated because going into it, I told myself I'm going to forget something on camera once we start recording. I'm going to forget something, but it was actually easier to retain the more we bounced off of one another.
Right.
And then I feel as if since that time, since we were both traveling last week, so we didn't get to record, I still remember things from that chapter I don't believe I would have remembered if we would have just read it and moved on.
Right.
So it really shows the power of the whole goal of the podcast again. So,
and that's definitely the goal for us. I mean, going back and just in our normal lives, our day-to-day lives, to be like thinking about those things that we were discussing, a couple times, you're sitting there and doing stuff and you're like, oh, paradigm shifts, and you're and you're thinking about how that applies to what you're doing in that moment, or how you're just can then apply that into different areas of your life. Anyway,
and that first chapter was a difficult chapter, talking about those paradigm shifts and talking about the personality and character ethic. The fact that I can remember those two names is a triumph in and of itself to this process, which we're all working on, because even if I would have forgotten something or just totally balled on something and just totally messed it up, it's just a part of being human and just learning through the process what this podcast is all about. So I really enjoyed it, and I'm ready to get into this next chapter and talk about it.
Let's see how much we remember.
Okay.
This chapter is, the second chapter is just a habits overview, an overview of the 7 habits. So you want to start with that?
Yeah, so this chapter, starting off, I think is one of the most important chapters when it comes to specifically getting into the 7 habits, not just to steal from the name that it is a 7 habits overview, but really once you begin to break down the material, I really feel as if, this 7 habits overview, the breakdown and how he carries ideas, and we'll talk about this as we get into the chapter, but as he carries ideas from that first chapter into the second chapter, especially when he talked about independence, dependence, and interdependence, which we'll get to here in a second as we break down those habits, really connected with the first chapter. And so we'll show some of that as we get into some quotes and maybe open up the book again for the second half of the podcast. But, and I don't know how much of this you remember, I'm not sure if I could recall how much terminology, the exact terminology he uses, but he starts off in this chapter talking about the importance of habits. And one thing I do remember is how he used that example of gravity and the Apollo 11, I believe he talked about, where he talked about the energy used to get that rocket off the ground and into space was the most energy used for miles after that as they were traveling in space. And the same is true for a habit, that getting kind of off the gravitational pull of the ruts that we've been in to start a habit. It requires three things. And the first one is the knowledge, which is the how-to he talks about, and the skill, the knowledge is what, the skill is how. And then the third part is what we're missing for that gravitational pull to get us out of the ruts, which is the desire. The motivation. So those 3 things were a great way to set up the chapter.
And that's how he defines a habit. He's like, let's sit down, let's actually define this thing that we're about to dive into, 7 of them that, he thinks are essential to being an effective person. And it's the intersection between knowledge, skill, and desire. Knowledge being the what, and then skill being the how, and desire being the want of those 3 things. And then those are the building blocks to forming a habit. And you really need all 3. Is basically what he was saying.
And you know how last week you were talking about working out was an example
Yeah.
that you used a lot. When I was reading this, because of course this can work for small habits, and like working out in the example I'm about to give are smaller, but they also of course are involved with the bigger and more important characteristics of our life. But every time I read that about the intersection between the knowledge, skill, and desire, I always think about making my bed in the morning. Some people are good at it. Some people are not. That's all I could think about, because my dad was one of those people where he constantly made you make up your bed the first thing you wake up, even before going to school. And that's when we would wake up, at 6 and be on the school bus by 6:30 type thing. And so I did get in a habit of it just because of that. However, since I've gotten older, I definitely have the knowledge. Everyone knows how to make up a bed. I definitely have the skill, to make up a bed. But the desire lately for me, especially ever since the shelter in place and stuff, and staying at home a little bit more, I just do not have the motivation. And that's the hard part. And what I found, to kind of connect us to the next part of this chapter, what I found was, as I did it less, my wife did it more. So I've become dependent on my wife to get it done, which is bad, because when she's not around or she goes somewhere, it just does not get done because the desire is not there. And that's just a very small example of some of these more, some of these bigger characteristics we have in our life. So the principle applies to all of them.
Right. And that exactly touches on the next section that he talks about. If I remember, it's the very next section, the maturity aspect of it. And so specifically when he's talking about the 7 habits, he's talking about a growth in maturity levels. And the first one being dependence. And this is true, I think these maturity levels are true for anything just in our lives. We have some, he breaks it down to different assets, different avenues where this is applicable. But, there's dependence, that stage where you have to rely on other people to be able to do something or be able to accomplish this. And then you have the independence phase where you are fully in control. You can do that thing, or you can make that thing happen on your own without any help.
Which he talks about that being a good place to be.
That is a good place to be.
Dependence is a dangerous place to be.
Right.
And independence is a good place to be, but there's even a better step.
And that's the interdependence arena, where then you're not just you could do things on your own. Yeah. And you have the amount of skill and capability in order to actually make that happen yourself. But you choose to work with others, and you choose to be interdependent, which then really gives way to an even greater outcome for you and for everyone else.
Yes. If I make up the bed on my own, it may not be as good as if my wife and I together were to make up the bed on your own. Again, another small example. But interdependence is the way to work. And I think we're going to see that because just like you mentioned, he said 1, 2, and 3 are tied to dependence, 4, 5, and 6 independence. The 7th one kind of overlooking all of them. And so if we can get to, as we get into these habits specifically over the next several weeks, if we can keep interdependence in the back of our minds, that as we form these habits, this is taking us from a level of dependence to a kind of an overview of all of them with interdependence. That's where we want to be. And again, connecting it to that first chapter, as I mentioned, we would talk about, that's where he, from that chapter title, Inside Out, that the best things come from the inside of us, outward first. I think also, that's how we work best as well, is as a team and with other people. But we have to get out of that dependence rut first, because independence is good, but teamwork is best. Right.
Yeah. And I like how actually all these ideas that he's presenting in these first 2 chapters, he's talking about them specifically as applicable to the 7 habits that he's about to get into, but it's also, what I like about it is that you can actually apply this to really anything in life. So even, for example, this podcast, right? And the goal of our goal is to actually try and remember what we're reading here, and not just forget it after we read it.
Right.
We could do this dependently, we could do it, we could do it independently even, and we can do it on our own.
Right.
You know what I mean? I could go, like I said in the first one, I could go just talk to myself talk myself through this chapter
Right.
on my own. I could probably remember some if I just, kind of out loud just talked about it, to myself. But I think the interdependence of us sitting down together and discussing this
Right.
is leaps and bounds better than if I was just doing this by myself
Right.
and trying to remember it, But I think that us doing this together and being able to discuss this at the same time and bounce back and forth with one another, it actually helps us remember things long term, and it gives us better benefits, not just me, but for the both of us.
Right. Yeah. And it doesn't only benefit the two or team people working together,
Right.
but it also benefits the product as well. And that's where he kind of gets into next, unless I'm forgetting something. Doesn't he move from the interdependence to the production capability?
Yes.
Does he get into that balance next?
Yes.
Okay.
So he talks about, and right there, and last thing for the maturity levels is that he lays it out, and you kind of touched this a little bit already, but he lays out how the maturity levels intertwine with the 7 habits that he has.
Yes.
So the first 3 habits are taking you from dependability or dependence into independence, and then the next 3 habits are taking you from independence to interdependence, and then the last 7th habit kind of wraps it all together and helps you continue in that journey. Because I think even with these habits, and then with anything else in life, you can fluctuate between interdependence, independence,
Yes.
and dependence.
Yes.
You can fluctuate depending on where you're at in your life, what's going on.
Yes.
You can fluctuate to those, so you could be at independence or you could be at interdependence, and you can fall back to dependence, in some cases, depending on, what's going on. But so it's a constant. The 7th one is that constant. And of course we get into that when we get into the 7th habit,
Yes.
but it's continuing to build on top of what was already built.
Right. Yeah. This journey certainly does not end after you read the book. That actually, for him, as he's setting it up, is just the beginning.
Exactly.
And I love how, and you pointed this out to me, and I read it, but you came to me and pointed it out, how in this book he actually states the goal that very well matches this podcast. Also, kind of his goal for the book is not that we would do these 7 habits, do these things alone, but that we would actually do them and enjoy them with other people.
Yep.
So
exactly. Yeah. So the next part is the P to PC balance, and he calls it a balance specifically because that's exactly what it is. And we'll go. So the best way, and this is definitely the best way to explain the P to PC balance, is really with that. That tale of the golden egg and goose.
Well, and the P stands for production.
Yes.
The PC stands for production capability.
Yes.
And so when we say P/PC, that's what we're talking about. But yeah, go ahead and give them that story of the golden egg and the goose, telling them which one is production. And
yes, because I know for the first time I read that, I'm like, PC, like production capability. What does that even mean?
Yeah, you got to read it a couple times.
You have to pay attention.
Yeah.
And I think, and even like I read this chapter, the last time I read this book, and I kind of really skimmed over this whole section because I was like, what is he even talking about? You know what I mean?
And we have a tendency when we read something and we don't understand it, just to go,
keep going.
It's not that important.
Yeah.
Which actually, it is the most important because that's about the rest of the chapter.
Right.
So
and I was that same feeling was coming back. And obviously because of this, I'm like, I push myself and I'm like, I gotta really understand this because I'm about to explain it without the book in front of me.
Yeah. And that's the pressure with doing it interdependently.
Right.
Is not having it in front of you, which we don't right now. And you're like, okay, I got to be ready to talk about this with my friend and not sound like a total idiot. Yep. I want to be able to discuss this and have that in mind. And that's where the reading to remember becomes so important.
Right.
So,
and pulling your own weight and stuff.
Yes.
But yeah, so the goose and the golden egg. So he equates the golden egg to the production.
Yes.
Or the product. And then the goose to the production capability. And, of course, the story with that is that the farmer, he goes to collect the eggs one day and there's a golden egg. And he finds out it's literally like just pure gold. And so then every day now the goose is laying another golden egg. And so every day he keeps getting another golden egg. Well, it gets to the point where now he doesn't want just one a day. He wants them all right now. Is that... Yeah. And so he decides to kill the goose in order to get the eggs. And turns out,
There's nothing inside.
there's no golden eggs there.
Right.
And so now he has literally killed the one thing that was producing that value. Mm-hmm. He killed the actual thing that was producing the value.
Right.
And so that's what he's talking about with production capability, the P to PC balance.
Yeah.
Is because whatever the golden egg is, whether that's, as we were talking about even before this podcast, whether we're talking about that's a national championship for a college football team.
Football conversation here.
Whether that's a certain amount of money that you want to make in a year.
Right.
Whether that's a certain job opportunity that
Right.
you want, or whether that's even just a good relationship or something you want out of a relationship with someone else. The golden egg is important, but you cannot disregard what produces the golden egg.
Right.
And that's what he's getting at with this. And it really applies to those three things that he mentions. There's three assets that is applicable to this relationship. And the first one is that it's relational or or human. That might actually be the last one. And then financial.
Yes.
And then emotional. Is that emotional? I think the first one was emotional.
Yes, I think the first one was emotional. I think the last one was relational because I remember him giving the finances in the middle and using a husband and wife illustration for the relational, because he moves through all three of these different assets, which are huge areas in our life to all of us, no matter what job you have, if you even have a job, all of those are very, very connected to everything that everyone does and lives through. So it's very easy to understand. So if you don't understand the whole golden egg and golden goose, because even that took me a little while. Had you heard of that before reading this?
I don't think so. No, I don't think I really heard it at least that explicitly stated like that. In anything else besides this book.
I hadn't either, and so that stumped me. So I had to go back and look at that a little while.
Right.
One illustration he gave that actually made a little bit more sense to me, just to help anyone out there who's like golden egg and golden goose. When we talk about this PC balance, is he talks about a man who works on a machine. And he doesn't even say what the machine produces, if I'm remembering that correctly. Doesn't even give what the machine's producing. Yeah. And so the machine itself, that could represent even our bodies in real life. So it could represent, just like that golden egg represents whatever that production, whatever you want out of that production capability may be. That's it. So he talks about this man who's working on this machine, and this machine just pumps out whatever it's producing in it. For years, it just goes and goes and goes and goes. Right. And so this company that he does, this unnamed company in this book, makes a lot of money, and so their profits go through the roof. And so the guy, retires and he's praised and all that. And then someone else comes in, and because this machine has been worked, but none of the assets or relationship to the machine have been taken care of, it crashes, it dies. They spend a lot of money trying to fix it because the production capability has been neglected. That relationship, his assets have been neglected for so long that it's pretty much become worthless. Right.
It's like running your car too hard and you're not changing the oil. You're not changing the brake pads.
Right.
And then it might save you money. But eventually your car's going to break down and you're going to have some serious issues.
Right.
And actually, while you were talking, I remembered now the three assets. Physical was the first one. And then financial was the second one. And the last one was human, which is relationships. The last one was human
relationships. Yeah. Okay. Clearly, I did not remember them either. So it's okay.
It's all right. The more we talk about this, like I said, it starts coming back. It starts coming back. And that analogy, that story specifically, that one was the one where it really clicked for me as well. Mm-hmm. That relationship, and I actually thought about this, and I mentioned it to you the other day. That this other analogy, of this relationship came to my head, and that was in the college football world, right? And so of course, I'm an Ohio State fan.
Ohio State, right? Yes.
I like Ohio State. You like FSU.
I am a Florida State fan. Yes.
And
not Florida State University.
Yes.
Okay.
And
I did not attend there. You did not attend Ohio State, but
nope.
Huge fans. But, anyway.
Yep. So it's funny that as I was reading this, that this idea came to me, of this relationship, right? So, for example, Urban Meyer was a head coach at Ohio State for a few years. He came on and he did a lot to help, progress football team forward, right?
Yes.
With good recruiting, good coaching, right? Won a national championship in
A golden egg, so to
2014,
speak.
golden egg, right? And then also, but I think the biggest thing as regarding to production and production capability is that he's not the head coach anymore. He left,
Right.
and now we have a new head coach, but he left it in such good shape that we're continuing on at the same level
Right.
that we were when he was head coach.
Yes.
And that would not have happened if he did not take care of the product capability. If he did not take care of the team and take care of it in a way that he could leave it and it would still be able to give the same high output.
Right.
Year after year.
Yes.
And I don't know as much about the story with FSU,
Well,
but I know a little bit. But that contrast
Yes.
actually stuck in my mind, especially thinking about you because I know that you're a Florida State fan.
Yes, the contrast there, everyone loves the victory stories, but I think it's in the defeats we really learn the lessons and really see,
Right.
The destruction that can come from, this PC balance being off in our life. And again, the beauty about this book and this principle of production and production capability is it applies to all areas. We see it in college football. We see it in, work and an organization, which he specifically talks about organization, which we'll get to. But so, yeah, with Florida State, a couple years back, Jimbo Fisher was the head coach. And in 2013, they won a national championship, which was a high for them. Florida State for like 36 seasons, I believe. I could be wrong on the number, but for 36 seasons, went to a bowl game.
Right.
And I'm not saying they won 36 years straight, but they went to a bowl game, which was the longest streak in NCAA Division I football, And so things were really working well. And it only really took one season for Jimbo Fisher's, in my opinion, for his attention to move. He may not say the story this way, but for his attention to move to where he went, which was Texas A&M. And so even in that 1 year, and it could have been a couple years leading up, but really you see out in the public in 1 year's time, he stopped focusing on those relationships, on that production capability, and left the organization in shambles.
Right.
And so now we've had Willie Taggart, and now he's gone, and now there's a guy from Memphis come in hoping to do something good with the team and get back to that relationship building, that production capability, and get back to producing what they were producing before all of that took place.
Yeah, and when it comes down to it, like he got the golden egg, but he did not care for the actual production capability. He did not care for the organization.
Yes.
In being able to still be able to produce after he's gone.
Yes. Yes. And let me say this just because I'm thinking about this as we've been talking this out, especially for those who may be listening or watching and they are connecting this principle maybe to their work. I was probably going to mention this eventually, so I'll just mention it now. Zach, I met Zach through Cornerstone Church, which is where I work at Americus, Georgia, and your dad is my boss, and he's an awesome boss. One of the reasons why he's an awesome boss, I'm not just saying that to suck up, because I know he's probably not listening to this podcast, is
probably
not, and you're his son, is because he concentrates on the relationship, on that production capability, and because of that, I want to produce for him. And so for some people listening, and they may be tired of their boss, or they really get on their nerves, or maybe their boss does not do a good job of, showing that production capability. We can start showing that to other people, and hopefully some things will change, and maybe our work environment will become a little bit more effective, because that's our goal for this book, is effectiveness. It's not just staying in the same place, but it is effectiveness. And so maybe taking some time to focus on that production capability rather than just always the product, which in the business world is the hugest temptation in the world, to focus just on the product. Maybe the effectiveness, this is how the effectiveness switches from off to on. It's through this balance.
Exactly. And he talks about how the PEPC balance is, can be, how that relationship works in an organization, and that's either a business or a church or whatever kind of, organization or institution you have. And in an organization, all three actually of those assets can be used: the physical, the financial, and the human or relational asset within the balance, and he talks about that. He talks about a customer. He's like, people were complaining. He said he was talking to people who own businesses and they were complaining about their employees, and they're like, how do I make my employees shape up or whatever? And he's talking about, you just need to, lay the hammer down on them. You know what I mean? And everyone was like, yeah, like they agreed. And they're like, then why don't, and Stephen Covey's like, why do you do that? Would you ever do that to your customers or something? And
Right.
they're like, oh no, never would do that to our customers. You know what I mean? But that's disregarding that's disregard for the actual person that is doing that job, and that you're not taking care of the actual person who produces for you.
Right.
And that's what he was talking about. He said, I underlined it because I thought it really struck me, is that you can pay for someone to do some work or something, but you will not be able to ever buy someone's brain and someone's heart.
Yes.
And their commitment level. You can't buy that.
Right.
Right. You may be able to buy people to, do something. You know what I mean? You can pay people, but money only goes so far.
Right.
Right. The actual true commitment, the true, like, I am devoted.
Yes.
Devotion to their whole being, like all of their, he says, creativity, their ingenuity.
Yes.
Their resourcefulness. You know what I mean? Those are things that can't be bought, really.
Yes.
And depending on how much you devote to actually cultivating that that relationship, that balance, into what actually produces for you, you're actually going to reap greater rewards and more golden eggs, in a sense.
Right.
If you don't focus on that and you only focus on the outcome.
Right. Yeah, and this is not necessary. This terminology is not in the book, but I think of heart commitment. In your mind, there's commitment in your mind when you have that balance between the production and production capability. And then loyalty comes from the heart. I tend to think of, for myself, loyalty comes from the heart, which if you have the commitment and the loyalty, the trust is there, the foundation is there, then it's going to be effective. And this is why he starts off the chapter talking about interdependence and that cohesive relationship that works so well and blends so well between other people. Is when you do have that commitment and that loyalty and that creativity and that ingenuity, it's going to be effective no matter what you're doing, whether it is making up your bed or running a Fortune 500 company.
Exactly. Yep. And it's crazy, something like that. Again, like he's talking about this specifically for like, the habits and stuff, but this can be applied to anything. Yeah. Literally to making your bed or to running a company.
Right.
And that's what's just so, I think, interesting about this stuff, is that you can literally take this idea and apply it to anything in your life.
Right. Which is why I'm so glad you came to me and were like, hey, let's start with this.
Right.
That is a good choice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I say we get into the book and maybe highlight some definitions and, pull out some quotes and then move on to the next chapter next week. You ready for that?
Sounds good. Let's do it. All right. So we're back. We got our book.
Yes.
I got my book here, and Chris, you have your phone.
I do. I love my Kindle app.
The physical versus the Kindle, man. I mean, hey, it still works.
I cannot fit any more books on my bookshelf. And this is not even my bookshelf.
That's not it.
It's not it, but it looks like that.
Yeah.
So I can't keep any more. But I just wanted to start off with this quote.
Right.
And we spent a good bit of time in the first part talking about dependence, independent, and interdependence, the difference between those three and why they're so important to becoming effective.
Yeah.
And he mentions here, to read the quote on what is page 71 in mine, it says, independent thinking alone is not suited to interdependent reality. That independent people who do not have the maturity to think and act interdependently may be good individual producers. And then he says this, which really hits you in the gut, but they won't be good leaders or team players. So the matter of the fact is, we live in an interdependent world, an interdependent reality. And we've talked about how before, even if you work with people at a certain organization and they just really get on your nerves and try you each and every single day, one, positive outlook to try to have is to remember this quote and to remember that we live in an independent reality. And even if we don't always get along, we are better together than we would be trying to do this independently, because we may be good producers, but eventually our bodies, our mind, our efforts, like that machine, are going to wear down, and we're not going to be producing anymore.
Yeah.
Eventually it can get to that point.
Yeah, and he says it, you said it, but he says it also later, life by nature is highly interdependent.
Yes.
And that's something that kind of sounds like duh, right?
Yes.
But it's really like you can't live life just doing your own thing necessarily. You have to be able to work with others, basically, is what he's saying. And if you have to work with others, you might as well learn to get good at it.
That's right.
Right. And then even, which is especially true, like, because I'm that kind of thing. Like, he says you may be physically independent.
Yes.
Right. You may be independent in this area or that area, but like, it's really slowing you down if you can't be interdependent and you can work with other people.
Right.
And that's tough for me as an Enneagram 1 because
I knew eventually we'd mention Enneagrams.
Right. I mean, but that's true. If anyone, knows about an Enneagram 1, it's that I like to do things perfect, and I don't even call them perfect. I'm just like, if we're going to do it, we might as well do it right.
Yes.
You know what I mean? That's my thinking.
Yes.
And I have a hard time letting people do other things because I know they won't be done the same way that I would do them.
Yes.
Right. I might as well do it because it'll be right when I do it. And that's such a hard thing to let go. But I realize even with that, even if I can do it better, you know what I mean? We can actually accomplish more if I hand things off and I delegate, even if it's not to the same level. It'll actually still, in the long run, it'll be more beneficial to me and to everyone else.
Yes, and these are all changes. Again, this is where it connects to the inside out. These are all changes where if you hand off something to someone else, to use your example you were just giving, what that's going to do is that's going to give you a little bit more time to rest. So eventually your body, your mind can produce more. And as an achiever, a number 3 on the Enneagram, since you were the one who introduced me to that as well, I think to myself that I could get more done if I do it all by myself because I can do it faster. And typically I think to myself, just because we're all selfish, that I could do it better.
Right.
We typically think that. Of course, we can say, well, when it comes to such and such, I'm not as good as that person. But I could get it done faster if I did it all by myself.
Right.
But he says interdependence is a far more mature and far more advanced concept, and we all want to think of ourselves as more advanced and mature in a sense, but he says that is a much more advanced concept. And for us to come to the realization, and not only the knowledge, but then also apply it, and also keep motivating to share the workload together, since we're using the organization example, to continue that is much more mature, and to be selfish, we will be better because of it. By
Exactly. And that's a hard thing to remember, especially for I think our numbers are very similar in that we're definitely more task driven and process focused than actually people oriented at times. So we have to work on actually being people oriented. In work and relationships and not just seeing everything as a to-do list or a task list or a got to get this done, got to accomplish this list. So, but yeah, I mean, that's definitely a really, really hard thing to, it's an easy thing to talk about and discuss. It's hard to put it in practice.
It is. Yes. Yeah. One thing to read a quote off of a book. Another thing for all of you to go out there to keep doing it.
Exactly.
So best of luck.
Yep. And as far as other things, I think we did a great job of covering the material. Now that I look back at the book and I kind of glance through this chapter, I think we did a pretty good job of covering pretty much everything he talks about. There's really, I think, just a few other quotes that I want to pick out from what he said, because, I mean, we explained the ideas, but I think adding a couple quotes, going over a couple quotes from him would just help bring those ideas even more to life. So I'm going to hop forward a few pages here, and I'm going to go now to the PPC principle section. And he's specifically talking about organizational PC here. So and again, we talked about this, but even to bring this point to light even more, he says the PC principle is to always treat your employees exactly as you would want them to treat your best customers.
Yes.
And of course, this is more than just a business thing. You can still, employ this, but seriously, people that do things for you, people that work for you, or even volunteers that work for you, you want to treat them, even if you're paying them, you want to treat them exactly how you would want your customer or whoever that you want to have the best impression on, really, right? Because you want the best. If you own a business, you want the best impression for you. You want your customer to have the best impression of you as a business, as a person, whatever. And you want those people that work for you you want to treat them the same way that you would want that person to be treated.
Right.
And this is the quote. I mentioned this quote when we were talking about this, but I want to repeat it here because this is really good. You can buy a person's hand, but you can't buy his heart.
Yeah.
His heart is where his enthusiasm and loyalty is.
Oh, so he does use loyalty.
He does use loyalty. You got it. Nailed it.
I didn't remember whether or not he uses loyalty, so he did. So There we go.
There you go. You can buy his back, but you can't buy his brain. That's where his creativity is, his ingenuity, and his resourcefulness.
Yeah.
And
then look at the next part too. He says PC work is treating employees as volunteers, which is interesting because we're thinking to ourselves, okay, we're paying these people.
Right.
They're not volunteers. But what they are volunteering is the best parts of themselves, which are their hearts and their mind.
Right.
We can volunteer our hands. We can do things with that. We can put a little bit of effort into it, kind of come to it from a mediocre stance and say, okay, let's get this done just to get this done. But when you are able to effectively reach the best parts of them, and you get this balance correct between the P and PC. I love how he phrases that.
Yep.
They volunteer the best parts.
Yep. And that's something you can, like, again, you can buy a person to some extent, but you cannot buy everything.
No.
You can't buy the best parts. And so the best parts of someone, the best that they can put forward towards a project or an idea or some kind of end goal, is something that you cannot buy with a physical thing.
Yeah.
Right. It's not a physical thing that you can do to motivate someone.
Right.
To that level of commitment or, commitment. To do. You can't motivate someone with a physical asset, a physical thing. Mm-hmm. It's all about the attention to the relationship and attention to that person as a person.
Yes. And you can't put all, this is why it's a balance. You can't put all your efforts towards just that side alone. Mm-hmm. In the first part, I used the example of your dad and I working together, our working relationship. He does focus on the relationship, but he also expects me at the same time to produce.
Yeah.
And so it's a balance. If you didn't have one without the other, then the relationship wouldn't remain effective.
Right, exactly.
And
that's what he says, the next quote that I have here. Effectiveness lies in the balance.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what he talks about here. And, of course, his whole goal, Stephen Covey's whole goal is effectiveness.
Yes.
As habits of highly effective people.
It's literally in the title.
Yes. And that's what the balance lies in. The effectiveness lies in the balance. Yeah. And so it's really a constant balance because you can't go too far one way. You can't go too far the other way even. And yeah, it's a balance. And he even goes on here, it's often a difficult judgment call, right? So these things aren't very even clear and set in stone as to, what way you need to go when balancing, this out. Mm-hmm. But it's definitely an interesting dynamic, to always, keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, for sure. The next quote that I think you had was under the how to use this book, which is the last thing that wraps up this chapter. So do you want to share your quote from there?
Actually, real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's one more quote here that I wanna take a look at, and I highlighted this because it actually again brought something to my own personal life that is really applicable. Mm-hmm. And he talks about the principle you can see validated in your own life when you burn the candle at both ends, or to get more golden eggs, and wind up sick and exhausted, unable to produce any at all, or when you get a good night's sleep and wake up ready to produce throughout the day, right? And that hits me, right? Because there are always days where you don't get what you maybe intend to get done, right? I could have a to-do list, and I'm like, if I just get these 2 things done today. This was literally yesterday, right? Literally yesterday, I was like, I wrote it down. I was like, I need to get these 2 things done. If I get these 2 things done, just these 2, it'll be a successful day.
Yeah.
Right. And I got 0 of them done.
Nice.
Right. I didn't get any of them done. And so the tendency for me, right, because I don't like that. That irks me as it probably irks you too.
Oh yeah, it would.
My tendency is to then, the way I react to that is to just, all right, I'm just going to work as late as, like, I just want to work until I get these things done, no matter how late it is. And that sounds like a good idea, maybe, but
also sounds exhausting.
Right. First off, I'm already tired at the end of the day. So trying to work later, I'm really not going to get much done because I'm not in a mental state that is ready to produce, right? Quality work, at least.
Yeah.
So what I even say, if I finish it, it might not even be that great, that thing that I get done.
It may not even be a golden egg. It's probably like a silver or a bronze egg.
A bronze egg.
It's not really what you had envisioned to begin.
Exactly. And then not only that, but then it cuts into my sleep.
Yeah.
So then I say, then I don't get 8 hours of sleep, or I get a late start the next day.
Yeah.
And it puts me off schedule. And then it actually not just ending it and ending the day and being like, all right, it's fine. I'll just get a good night's sleep and move on to the next day. Instead of doing that, if I work late and I maybe get those projects done, it'll actually have negative effects on the rest of my day, maybe even the rest of my week. And
then the rest of your month.
Right. And it's just a cycle.
And that's why people pick up this book, because they see the title, Effective People, 7 Habits, and they pick up this book probably thinking to themselves, how did I get to where I am, where I had, at one time in my life, I had goals and ambitions and drive, and now I seem to have none of that. And it starts even with the smallest of things, like you've just mentioned, and it happens to all of us.
Exactly. And that's why he says effectiveness is in the balance.
Yeah.
Right? I could work all day long. I could work 20 hours. I could work 20 hours a day, but I'm not going to sustain that in any kind of way that's actually meaningful.
Right.
And then I'm going to ruin my sleep. I'm not going to be able to focus. I'm not going to be able to concentrate. You know what I mean? The list goes on. Yep. But I also can't work just like 2 hours a day and be like, all right, that's 2 good hours of productivity. I can clock out for the day. There's a balance there, right? And that's the hard thing, because me personally, I don't know how it is for you, but I tend to push myself on the one end of that, to push myself harder until I get the result. Alarm going off.
Is that to do the podcast?
No, it's for something else.
It's for something else that you're trying to produce.
Right. Exactly.
That's funny.
So anyway, back to what we were talking about.
Yes.
I have the tendency to push myself harder especially if I don't get things done that I have in my mind that I want to get done, or I need to get done, that type of thing. So I need to, it's the cutting that off at some point and being like, all right, I need to get back to the balance here. I can't sometimes there are times where you need to work later at night. You know what I mean? For a deadline or something like that. Sometimes that happens, but it's the ebb and flow, but trying with the goal in mind of staying towards the middle.
Yes.
And finding that balance, and then riding in that as much as possible. Because me personally, I found that actually when I get 8 hours of sleep and I go to bed at the same time every day, I get up at the same time every day, I have a nice balance in life where I'm working and also then have times where I'm, doing things that are leisurely and getting a certain amount of rest. That when I actually have that balance, overall, I just operate better as a person,
and everybody will.
And effectiveness, and it's so true. That's actually part of the reason that coronavirus is almost it knocks everyone off their schedule, and so now it's like even if we all had good balance, we gotta work to get that back now, in some way with this virus, but
and that's because the reason why we work so much better when we're in the balance, we are so much more effective, is because we've entered back into that interdependence reality.
Exactly.
We've learned that we cannot do it all on our own. And for me though, when you mentioned, I don't know how you are, but this is, and spelled all that out. For me, I think being married helps me with kind of that balance. And that's some pressure that I put on myself, but I'm certainly not perfect at it. I, in fact, am more of the opposite, where if I don't, I'm just going to quit, which does not help with production at all. So if I have a list of things, let's say I do want to get 2 things done, just to go with your example, and I get none of them done, I'll just quit. I may not come back to it tomorrow. I may do other things, and I may do other things that I don't even need to do, nor do I really have any business doing at the moment. It may be good later, but I don't have any business doing it right now, and so I'll just quit and walk away. And that, again, messes with that balance and exits interdependent reality that we are always living in. So
that's really interesting. And that also goes to the point of there's no right or wrong answer here.
No.
It's all about finding your personal, it's like you said, it's a judgment call.
Yes.
And you got to make that judgment call for yourself.
Yes.
No matter which way you lean or which way you go. Yeah, very interesting.
Yes.
And so the last couple sections of this chapter, there are a couple headlines. There's one, how to use this book, and then the other one is what you can expect. And so how to use this book, the funny thing about this is that he asks for you to, he says he would suggest 2 paradigm shifts to us. So again, going back to the first chapter, paradigm shifts here. He suggests 2 paradigm shifts that you would at least think about and try and work towards. First, he says, I would recommend to you that you see this material as a book, or see this material not just as a book, in the sense that it is something to read once and put it on a shelf. Yeah. So he's saying, he goes on in the next chapter, but he's saying, read it through, right? Then maybe go back, reread it, and really dig into each part. And then also, contemplate the ideas, right? Try and put it into practice.
Right.
It has to be, it's like a living document.
Right.
Almost,
Continue to have conversations about it, even if it's not as formal as sitting down and with the purpose and the goal of sitting down. Also, you can go back and listen to this podcast time and time.
Exactly. Yep. And just to better understand, revisiting the material to better understand it, to better apply it.
Yeah.
And so that's the first paradigm shift. The second is that he would suggest that you shift your paradigm of your own involvement in this material from the role of learner to that of the teacher. And the funny thing about this, he goes on and says a little bit more too. The funny thing about this is that I really did not remember that this was even here, that he said this. And this is pretty much what we're doing right now with this podcast. This is the goal of this podcast.
Yes.
And he said, if you had known, for example, that you would be teaching the material on the PPC balance principle to someone else within 48 hours, which is what we're doing,
yes,
would it have made a difference in your reading experience? And for me, doing this podcast, yes, by far. It has made a difference in my reading experience. I am, just like with even understanding the PPC balance, I am reading this, and I'm reading it differently than I read other books.
Right. Well, if, again, and I mentioned this in the first episode, but if we listen to a book, and let's say we listen to it on 1.5 or 2 times speed, it can take, depending on how long the book is, 4 to 5 hours. And I just listen to that, and I'm not listening to that to teach anybody else. Yeah. So I can listen to a whole book and maybe remember one thing from it, which I've retained a lot more just from switching that role from learner to teacher and discussing this in a sense. Us teaching it to one another within 48 hours, I remember so much from the first chapter already. I know the same is going to be true for this as well. So, yeah.
Exactly. It switches. There's like a switch that goes off in your brain, and you go from just passively reading to be like, okay, I'm going to have to explain this to someone else, so I better pay attention here.
Yes.
Is basically what it comes down to. And it really does. That's the reason why I wanted to start this, is because it would help force myself to pay more attention, not just to passively read something. So far it's definitely working, and that's what Stephen Covey suggests you do anyway. So, So, I find that funny that this is here.
Yeah.
That I really did not know that it was here.
No. Did not start this book with the expectation of that being in here, but that's exactly how he wants us to use this book, which again is just magical for us doing this. So, great job, Stephen.
Right. And so then this last section, what you can expect, which I like this because he just talks a little bit about as you implement these habits, as you start to use them more and be able to move from dependence to independence to interdependence, how it can affect your life, and it can affect it in a positive way. You know what I mean? You'll be able to work better with others. And he starts here at private victory, right? Your self-confidence will be increased because you have good personal habits that develop your inward self.
Yes.
And then you'll be able to define yourself from within, and rather than by people's opinions or by comparisons to others.
Yes, which will bring so much more
Right.
happiness and ease in life just doing that. It does
Right.
take patience. It's not a quick fix. This is none of this that we're talking about and what he talks about in the rest of this book, these habits. By no means are we just going to turn around and be perfect at this tomorrow.
Right.
But the payoff is huge.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's definitely something like that specifically is probably something that a lot of people nowadays especially struggle with. I mean, people have struggled with that for forever, and everyone does at some point. But nowadays maybe even more so.
Well, this is the first age we've lived in where we can have just about anything at our fingertips, no
Right.
problem. And that's even enhanced.
And everyone's opinions
right
right in front of you.
Right. And I think that has been even boosted during this COVID-19 time
Right.
where we've been kind of apart. And, I think that's just grown more and more that we want to be heard. We see our life during this time compared to other people, like you mentioned.
Right.
And I think it is harder now than it ever has been before.
Exactly.
But
And then, as he says, we move into the public victory of the next three habits that take us from independence to interdependence. The public victory habits, your good relationships will improve, become deeper, more solid, more creative, and more adventuresome. And you'll be able to rebuild old relationships that may have fallen apart, and then even build new ones that are good and healthy, and be able to start those from the right place from the beginning.
right, which will make those relationships even more meaningful, longer lasting. Hopefully won't have the same mess ups that we've all had in the past before when it comes to those. So again, effectiveness, and we're going to repeat that throughout the book as we talk about it.
And then, of course, the last habit, which just encompasses all of them and helps continually growing. And that's when he says it. You said it already, but it's not a quick fix, and it's a continual improvement process. And that's basically what the seventh habit is about.
Yes, yeah, and that will wrap up the book. And then after that, though, we'll continue to pull off the book, just as he mentions on how to use the book. We'll pull it off. Maybe not on a podcast, but we'll pull it up, and read it and venture it again. Because again, after you finish reading it, that's just the beginning of it. So go back
and that pretty much sums it up for this second chapter here.
That does. I didn't mean to, but I was looking at the end of this book, and when I mentioned that obviously none of this is a quick fix, he encourages us with the last couple sentences in this chapter. He says, "But I'll assure you, you will feel benefits and see immediate payoffs that will be encouraging."
Right.
That's how he ends.
Cool. And that concludes part one of this book. So then we'll move into part two, which is the private victory section.
Yes, the dependent habits.
Yep. And the first habit one, be proactive.
Yes.
And that's what we'll be talking about next week. Habit number one.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
Yeah,
I'll see you then.
See you, man.